small groups. So it's an intellectual habit that becomes a virtue if you habituate it, in which if somebody says, okay, I'd like to do this, and you trace, you don't just say, okay, well, okay, I know what would probably happen initially, and I know what you want to happen there. But the question is, you want to trace the consequences of that action or that policy, not just the things you expected, but the things you hadn't expected, the unintended consequences of that policy. Like the minimum wage. So somebody says, you know, it would be great if we had a federal minimum wage of $100 an hour, and then we'd all be rich, right? Now, I've had this conversation. This isn't just made up. I've had people tell me just this very thing before. And it sounds great. I assume anybody that says that, they're not thinking, I want massive unemployment. They're thinking everybody will be rich. They'll all have, you know, jobs worth $100 an hour. What they're not thinking about is the fact that most people's labor is actually just, unfortunately, not worth $100 an hour. And so if that were actually the law, most of us in this room probably wouldn't have legal jobs. Because they're not thinking about, okay, you know, if you're an employer and you have to pay somebody far more than their labor is actually worth, it's not going to be rational for you to even hire them. So what they do is it would create massive unemployment. And you don't realize that, because if somebody's not realizing it, what they're doing, are they not thinking about their fellow man? No, they're not understanding the nature of economic reality. In this case, they're not thinking about supply and demand and the price function. They're not thinking about the fact that a particular person's labor doing some job in some place has a particular economic value. And you can't change the value of their labor by making it illegal for anyone to pay them less than that. So it's not a question of their sort of moral intuitions being wrong. It's a question of not sort of getting the nature of economic reality. Now, this is a very important myth, and in some ways the most tragic, because this is the one that's the most tempting for us as Christians. And the reason, I think, is because we know in the moral life, both why we do something and what we do matters. God cares not just that particular action that we perform, but the reason for the action. So, for instance, if we're in Minnesota, so let's say you're a hunter, right? I've got a man here as an example. He's married, he's a hunter, and he just shows up one day and he gives his wife 2 dozen roses. It's not her birthday, it's not their anniversary, he hasn't done anything wrong that he knows of. He just gives her these roses, right? And so you think, okay, externally, that seems like a nice thing to do. But let's imagine that he's been on 3 3-day weekend hunting trips already this year. His wife hates these. He's gone for 3 days, leaves the kids there, doesn't mow the lawn, right? And he wants to go on a 4th. And so he's greasing the skids before he raises the point, so he gives her a couple dozen roses, right? So you see how that changes the nature of the act, right? The reason that he did it, now it's not an act of gratuitous love, it's just manipulation, right? Okay, we know that in the moral life. That's the point of the widow's mite. That it's because she gave out of her poverty made it a morally significant act. It wasn't the amount of money she gave that was significant. And so we know both the internal and the external matter in the moral life. That's a mistake when we're thinking about economics. The effect of an economic policy, of an act, is the same no matter what the motivation for us supporting it is. So when 535 members of Congress vote on a bill, 435 in the House, 100 in the Senate, imagine they vote for some act unanimously and the president passes it. The effects of that policy are going to be the same whatever their motivations are. And they could have 535 different motivations. It actually doesn't matter. And so the point of the piety myth is what we want to do is we want to focus on the actual effects of policies, and if anything, ignore the intentions, because the intentions end up being a decoy that causes us to assess policies based on this internal thing that actually ends up not mattering economically. And that's a hard thing to do, because what we want to do if we're going to assess a policy is we want to know, well, what did they mean by that? What did they mean to do? Well, okay, yeah, 2 million people starved because we collectivized the farms, but you know, it meant well. I mean, this is the kind of thing that people often do, and it's the result of believing the piety myth. I call it the piety myth because of this great quote from a 20th century French philosopher named Etienne Gilson, who said, piety is no substitute for technique. By technique, he just means the practical know-how that you need to have in order to get something done. So Craig, for instance, uses practical know-how. If you're going to build planes, if you're going to build rockets, they're going to stay in the air. There's just some things you need to know, Bernoulli's principle and principles of lift and drag and all these kinds of things. And no matter how pious you are, no matter how pure your heart is, no matter how in touch you are with God, there's still technical knowledge you need to know if you're going to keep a plane in the air. That's his point. And the temptation is to think, well, piety is the only thing that matters. It might be the only thing that matters if you're concerned about the state of your soul, right? But if you're concerned about getting planes to stay in the air, there's actually something more to it. So let me give you a few examples of this very briefly, because in fact, I give a talk very frequently now at Christian colleges called Why Good Intentions Are Not Enough, and it's the most depressing thing you've ever seen. It's an hour of bad examples of good intentions gone bad. But the easiest example to remember is rent control. Now, rent control, I doubt you have it in Minneapolis, St. Paul, but this was a very popular thing in the 1960s and 1970s in large metropolitan areas. And what rent control essentially is it was a response to the realization that in large metropolitan areas, think like Manhattan or Hong Kong or Rome or London, the price of rental housing gets just sort of out of sight very quickly. And so there's a huge number of people, there's high demand, and so the price for rental housing gets really, really high. And so city councils would get together and say, the sort of lower income people can't afford basic rental properties in the city. What are we going to do? And it occurred sort of simultaneously to city councils around the world to implement rent control. And what rent control does is it just places a ceiling on the price that landlords can charge for rent. So essentially, let's say a city decides that one-bedroom apartments cannot be legally, you can not legally charge more than, say, $400 a month for rent for one-bedroom apartments, all right? So the goal is what? The goal is to keep the price below $400 a month for one-bedroom apartments so that lower-income people can afford them. That's always the goal. Now, guess what the effect is whenever rent control is actually tried? It's to create a shortage in precisely the segment of housing that was designed to be protected. So it does exactly the opposite. And you can see why this is. It's not complicated economics. All you have to do is think about it from the perspective of the landlord. So let's say you have a 10-story apartment building. It's all one-bedroom apartments. It costs you $700 a month just to maintain each unit. Right, and you can only charge, what did I say, $400? Yeah, okay, yeah, I'm just testing you. I remembered, no, I didn't. $400 a month, all right? But it costs you $700 a month just to maintain it. So just to maintain the property, you're gonna lose $300 a month if you rent it out. And so unless you have some weird psychological deficiency where you like losing money or torturing yourself, you'll do something else. What will you do? Well, you'll convert it to a condominium, sell it. So it's not rental property, so it's not, of course, it's not under the jurisdiction of the rule. Convert it to commercial property, so it's a store or a warehouse or something other than a residence, or you'll let it go to pot, right? Because you won't maintain it, so you don't lose money, and then you become a slumlord, and then it's eventually condemned, and then people can't live there. So you actually, because of city councils not attending to the function of what prices actually do in a market, and the way in which they provide signals about underlying supply and demand, because they ignored that, they actually implement a policy that does exactly the opposite of what they intended to do. It's only in economics that this is allowed to happen. Right? This doesn't happen in airplane design. It doesn't happen in groceries. It doesn't happen in sort of basic retail where people do things that do the exact opposite of what they want to do, and they manage to keep doing it. Right? But this actually happens in economic policy, and that's the consequence. Notice, it's not the consequence of them not loving their fellow human beings. Remember, I assume that these policies are always implemented for the desire of helping lower income people. But the effect is exactly the opposite. It creates a shortage. Well, I'm not going to talk about this. This is a financial crisis. I've got an entire book on this if you want an example. Craig gave a brief summary called Infiltrated, but the financial crisis was in fact the sort of mother of all piety myths, because as Craig said, it was a result of, on the one hand, Fed policy, and on the other, a bunch of very, very well-meaning policies called affordable housing goals. The purpose of these policies was to make mortgages and home ownership available to lower income people. That was the purpose of these. There were about, in the book, I found about 24 of these different programs spread out across the federal government. The effects of the policy, unfortunately, were to